Hello, everyone, and happy Thursday. Welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Jamie Henkel. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Learning and Inclusion Manager at pflagnation.al. I'm going to be with you in the chat, in the comments, and all over the places today, so let me know if you have questions. And just like every week, I'm going to bring in Jean Marie Nevada to facilitate today's conversation. Hi,
Hello,
Jean Marie.
Jamie Henkel.
How are you?
I'm good because I'm really counting the days till holiday vacation. It's not that I don't love my job, but I really need a nap.
Yeah. And Jean Marie, I am going to say something that you say to me all the time, which is, it's freezing. I'm so cold. It's so cold.
Freezing is relative, Henkel.
That's true.
As you remind me every time I say it.
Yeah. Here it's really cold, but I'm going to head out and let you get us started.
Thanks, Jamie. Hey, everybody. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. My pronouns are she and her, or ella if you use Spanish. I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at pflagnation.al, and every single week we get together to talk about something related to LGBTQ inclusion and equality. And this week we have another conversation that I think is a really important one. So I have to tell you, when we first started doing our show planning for the month, we kind of were looking at the month and we saw the holidays coming up and we thought, oh, we should definitely have a conversation about other religious traditions outside the traditional Christmas stuff. And began by talking about, we should definitely discuss some of the Jewish traditions around the holidays and intersections with queerness. And then as things started to develop, it became clear that while we wanted to talk about that, there are much more pressing conversations in this space that we need to have. So let me quickly get us started by just letting you know our article for the week, if you like reading along. It's available at straightforequality.org/discussion series. This week it's from NBC News. The really, really brilliant Julia Ainsley has an article about how Department of Homeland Security warns of domestic terror threats to LGBTQ, Jewish, and migrant communities. And let me just give you a little background on this one if you didn't have a chance to read the article. A representative from DHS actually said that Americans who are motivated by hateful ideology pose, and this is a direct quote, a persistent and lethal threat to certain communities. And three that were specifically called out were Jewish communities, LGBTQ communities, and those of migrants. And they said that it is an absolutely enduring threat to people who are Jewish. But I wanted to quickly just read a couple of headlines to you just from the past few days. In New York, we had a report that hate crimes against New York City Jews have more than doubled in November, going up about 125%. In Los Angeles, LA County has seen hate crimes in its highest level in 2 decades. Christopher Wray has actually said that Jews are under threat from people on all sides. And as we start moving into the LGBTQ space, we are seeing very, very similar statistics. In Los Angeles, it's the highest report of hate crimes in about 19 years. The Armed Conflict Location and Data Event Project had some really chilling statistics, and let me share some of these with you. There have been more than 200 anti-LGBTQ incidents reported this year. That's 3 times higher than last year and 12 times higher than 2020. And that far-right militia efforts have actually increased 3-fold over last year. So what our communities are experiencing every single day and have been experiencing for a long time, even though a lot of people were not talking about it or acknowledging it, it is really extreme. And it's putting people in a place of fear, but also in a place of what do we do about this and why is this happening? And so I'm really excited to bring in our 2 guests today. We have 2 fantastic representatives to help us have this conversation. The first is Rabbi Danya Rutenberg, who is a rabbi and author. Hello, Rabbi.
Hi.
And I'm also going to bring in Faith Williams, who is the Associate Director of Government Relations and Advocacy at the National Council for Jewish Women. Hey, Faith, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm okay. Although I have to admit, I was hoping we'd be having a much happier conversation, but I think it would be remiss for us to focus on holidays when all of this is going on. So I really appreciate you both being here. But before we get into the conversation, I want to make sure that people know about both of you and about the kinds of work that you're doing. So Rabbi, could you tell people a little bit about yourself and your work and how people can learn more about your work if they're interested?
So I serve as scholar in residence at the National Council for Jewish Women, and we do a lot. We serve as a grassroots organization with over 210,000 people nationwide who are lobbying, activating, and change making on the ground. And then we on the national level are also doing a lot of work to not only change policy, write laws, pass laws, push the right government agencies to get good laws and good policy in place, but we're moving the Jewish community to activate and to become change makers. So, for example, I at NCJW helped oversee a project called Rabbis for Repro. We have a network of over 2,000 rabbis and cantors and other Jewish clergy who have pledged to preach and teach and activate their communities around reproductive health, rights, and justice. And we have Repro Shabbat is coming up. That's February 17th and 18th this year. And if you go to reproshabbat.org, you can find more information. And there we're going to get a nationwide, last year we had 900 communities, and this year will be much more, experience of Jews learning and teaching and destigmatizing their communities, because Judaism teaches that abortion is not only permitted, right? It is required when the health and safety of the pregnant person is at risk. And so abortion bans are a violation of our religious freedom, as well as being, of course, a 14th Amendment violation for everyone. And we have an obligation as Jews to not only fight for our own, I mean, abortion justice is a Jewish issue because we as Jews have abortions, right? 1 in 4 people who can get pregnant have abortions by the age of 45. But we have an obligation to fight for justice for everyone, and people who are struggling financially, BIPOC communities, trans men and non-binary people, youth immigrants, many other people are more impacted by these bans and really, really harmed. And particularly trans men and non-binary people who are turned away from gendered clinics, who are or forced to be gendered, or misgendered in ways that are really, really problematic if they're trying to get abortion care, wind up trying unsafe methods to terminate pregnancies 3 times a rate greater than cisgender women. So abortion justice really it's a LGBTQ justice issue. It's a Jewish issue. It's an everybody issue. So that's what we're up to.
I so appreciate you talking about that, because I think so much of the time the narrative on reproductive health is people with faith are opposed to anything that is progressive and inclusive. And so I have such incredible gratitude for you and for especially the clergy and people of faith who are doing this work, because I think it is turning the conversation on its head, as it should have been, because it has always deserved to be on its head a little bit. We're not hearing those voices. So thank you. Thank you for that. And hopefully some of that will surface, because I think part of this conversation actually feeds into where we are going. Faith, tell me a little bit about your work and how, if people want to know a little bit more about that, they can find out.
Sure. So as you said, and thank you first so much for having us today. I'm the Associate Director of our Government Relations Department. And so really all I'm trying to do is build relationships with partners like PFLAG and elected officials and government officials to advance our priorities, which Rabbi Rettenberg, alluded to. So that's what I do. And if folks want to learn more about National Council of Jewish Women, we have this beautiful scrolling bar at the bottom. So if you start there on our website, sort of 2 things I really encourage you to do. The first is to sign up for our updates, our action alerts, learn what we're up to. And the second would be to check out if there's an NCJW section near you. We have incredible sections across the country. That's what we call our chapters or affiliates. Other organizations use other names. See if there's one in your state or city and reach out and get involved. They do the most incredible work. And as a federal advocate, I learn and grow from them every day.
I have to say, in my life prior to PFLAG, I worked at American Association of University Women, and we did so many things with NCJW.
Oh, wonderful.
And the one thing that I knew that we could always rely on was people showed up. Like, you have such a great, powerful network. So if Faith's not kidding, seriously, check out and see if there's a section near you, because they do amazing work. And I think it's really nice ways of connecting in your community. So I don't think that where I want to go with this conversation needs much of a preamble. I already talked about some of the reports that we're hearing, some of the statistics that we're hearing. But I want to ask both of you, and Rabbi, maybe we can start with you on this one. What exactly is going on there? I mean, anti-Semitism is not new. Attacks on the Jewish community are certainly not new, but it does seem that we are at a really extreme and severe boiling point. Where did this come from? What do you think got us here?
Well, some of what's happening is very, very old. So for the last 1,000+ years, if you look at the history of Jews in Europe, what's happening now fits a very clear pattern. For over 1,000 years, the game in Europe for the longest time was blame the Jews, not us. Right? If it was somebody in power and the people were feeling unhappy, discontent, there's a famine, there's a plague, things aren't going well, they're not doing a good job, they just point and say, it's the Jews' fault. And I can get into all of the history of how that happened, but we were the white Jews or Jews in Europe, right? The people who look like me, we were the racial and ethnic other in Europe. We were racialized, and it was like we were the religious other. We, refused to convert to Christianity, which was very problematic for those in power. And so it was very easy to scapegoat us. And so we would get expelled, or there would be a pogrom or whatever. But it was this constant game, blame the Jews, not us. And so then the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is the Jews have a world, are not only behind whatever's wrong with the plague or whatever today, but they're running everything secretly behind the scenes, was written by the Tsar in Russia in 1902, as everybody in Russia was discontent and gearing up for the 1905 revolution, right? Blame the Jews, not me. And so now, fast forward, 2022, we are however many years into this pandemic, right? We have had an authoritarian president who tried to overthrow the government, and now we have a different person in power, and there's all of this sort of destabilization around what's going to happen next. We had this uncertainty about how this election was going to go, and now we have had the election, but we don't know what's going to happen once the new Congress comes in, right? This is this time of stress and uncertainty, and Christian nationalism is on the rise, right? They've been emboldened by Trump and that all of that wave, and the fruition of 50 years of work with the destruction of Roe v. Wade, has given them so much permission to pursue meaner and meaner goals. Right now, we're going after same-sex marriage, where trans rights have been, trans people have been under horrific attack this whole time, contraception, et cetera, right? So we're in this time of anxiety and stress. And so it's classically, right? It's like, well, somebody's got to be responsible for all of this. Why is everything so terrible? Somebody's behind the scenes, right? And so that's one piece of it. And the other thing that's really critical to remember is that celebrities say something. And so then people start to notice the anti-Semitism that maybe all agrees going on, right? To some degree, celebrities say something, and so people get emboldened and do more anti-Semitic actions. And to some degree, the media just starts reporting on anti-Semitism in a different way, right? Trans people are still getting attacked and murdered constantly. And the media is not lifting that up because their lives are not considered as worthy, as important, as critical, right? That doesn't mean, is there a spike in hate crimes against trans people? Was there, when this law was passed, we probably, but it's not getting reported. So we don't have that information. So we have to remember that as well.
Yeah. And, I appreciate the way that you were putting this together, because I think one of the things that has frustrated me lately is I find myself screaming at people, this isn't new. This has been going on forever. You just haven't been paying attention. And I think you're right. One person of high profile says something and suddenly we start talking about it, but this is by no means a new conversation. Faith, I would like to touch you because you're doing this in a government relations sense. You're trying to see how all these conversations are interconnected. We are not just seeing spikes of attacks on Jews. We are seeing spikes of attacks on the LGBTQ community, on immigrants and migrants. We are seeing lots of other groups being attacked. What are the ways in which they're connected? When you look at this, how does this all connect? And is any of this random, or do you think that these are all actually very concerted efforts?
Oh gosh, it's a good question. They are not random. They are all concerted efforts, and the through line is white supremacy. And I also want to name, just right at the outset, and Rabbi Rettenberg did this as well. There are queer Jews, there are Black Jews, there are immigrant Jews, there are Latina and Latino and Latinx Jews. They're right, every stripe, color, etc. And so when we talk about hate crimes and bias, it's important to remember that some folks in our community are getting hit on every side. And the through line to that, as I mentioned, is white supremacy. So the emboldening of white supremacists over the past 6 years in particular is alarming. People used to have to hide some of their beliefs, but now they don't really have to hide, and there doesn't seem to be any consequences for coming out from under their rocks, as I imagine they live under rocks. And so this looks like the attack in Buffalo, it looks like when we talk about, and I've seen this just this week, rhetoric around immigrants at the border, the illusions, the rhetoric we use that compares people to disease or to vermin. This is something that as Jews, we know intimately, and it's very dangerous language. It, of course, shows up at Club Q in Colorado Springs recently in that attack. Or the attacks on the North Carolina power stations that is oddly not getting a ton of media so far as I can tell, but seems to be related to the fact that the community dared to have a drag show in their town. So these attacks build off of each other, and the rhetoric again of the Trump administration and before truly like has really borne fruit. And I hate to say borne fruit because that's such a positive verb,
Yeah.
but it's really resulted now in just like this emboldening of extremism, I would say.
I find it really interesting that you say that, because it's something I've been thinking about a lot. And we all do this work. We know that individuals who harbored these beliefs have always been around. They've always been organizing. But I do think there is a significant shift that has happened as we look at, sort of in the public eye, elected officials, people getting elected at the national level. And we are not just talking about the former president, who really do harbor these really extreme views and who have no bones about expressing them. And I think that's one of the switches. Rabbi, what do you have on that?
I mean, I don't think that's new necessarily. Storm Thurmond. I mean, we have had racists and anti-Semites in power forever, but right, for a while it wasn't considered as permissible, and now we have we have Congress people tweeting that about the beauty of Christian nationalism, which
yeah. And I think I always think about it, I'm like, we used to be able to point to the Strom Thurmonds of the world, the one or two, but I feel like now when we start sort of addressing it, we're looking at a lot of people. And I think that is kind of significant. Rabbi, I have to admit to you, as I was preparing for the show, I was looking at the article that we were sharing with people and looking at who have been primary targets of attacks by white nationalists lately. And as I looked at the specific groups that were mentioned, I'm like, this isn't the first time that we have seen these groups being told you are in danger. This is definitely following past patterns. Is this something that should be giving people pause? That obviously, we can't say things happen. History does repeat itself, but it repeats itself with a twist every single time. Is this of concern? I mean, or am I sort of predicting a catastrophe where maybe there isn't one?
I mean, in a lot of ways, this is the same groups that get attacked every single time. The first people that Hitler went after were queer and trans people. The burning of the Institute of Sexology in Germany was the watershed moment in 1933, I believe. The burning of significant research. The first gender confirmation surgeries happened in Germany, and we lost all of this research. And the rounding up of gay and lesbian people happened in 34. Right, and trans people, though it's it wasn't given that language, but it was also
Right.
Right, and immigrants have always been under attack. Jews have always been under attack. So I honestly, the through line is, as Faith said, it's always been white supremacist patriarchy every place you look. And I don't think there's a big difference in terms of there are people now in Congress saying the quiet part out loud. And yes, there have always been people in Congress who believe these things. I can think of a lot of people who are prominent senators who have been, who have been leading the Senate, who have been, happily standing next to white supremacists and happily, embracing their Confederate flags. That they don't say the quiet part out loud because they know that there's a certain line you're not supposed to cross.
But I think that's it. I think the quiet part's being said.
Voting that way.
Yeah. The quiet part is being said, being vocalized, and it isn't that everybody's stopping and saying something's wrong. Faith, that actually sort of brings me to it's a bit of a policy question I wanted to ask you, which is, when we've talked about terrorism in the United States, particularly since 9/11, when we said terrorism, the assumption was that it was somebody from outside of this country. It was a foreign threat who was attacking us. And yet what we are seeing is that some of the deepest threats, and this has been established by DHS, actually are coming from people inside of the United States. It is domestic terrorism, a word that we're definitely not hearing enough people use, and labeling some of these behaviors as that. Why do you think this story isn't being more prominently discussed? We certainly are talking about security and terrorism, but we're not having this conversation.
That's such a good question. And I've been thinking about this as a paradigm shift and talking a little bit with Rabbi Rettenberg. And I was thinking about this, that if we look at the people in power historically and today, mostly white folks, mostly white men. And so terrorism has felt to them like this external threat. But I'd imagine that if we were in the South in the 1950s, terrorism would not feel like a threat from abroad. It would feel like your neighbor up the street who, on Saturday nights likes to wear a white hood and have fun with his friends. So I think to a degree, it has felt this way because all the apparatuses of power are mostly white, mostly male. And so it filters through this one thing. I also do think, though, that in the wake of 9/11, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, which really, there's whole books and podcasts about it. I'll very briefly, that's a big ship to turn around. Bureaucracy is real. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. But when you have a sort of a mishmashy government agency doing kind of the same thing the same way for 21 years, it cannot turn on a dime, certainly. And I think that's some of the structural reasoning as well, as sometimes bureaucracy can be a bit slow, even when we know that the call is coming from inside the house. And even as we recognize that the call has largely always been coming from inside the house. So I think that's some of why we don't see it as much. It's how we think about it, and also the fact that it's a shift of policy and procedure, and that takes time as well.
Thank you for that. That's actually a perspective that I hadn't really considered, that it really is hard to kind of turn the ship that is so big. Thank you. That really gives me a lot of perspective. So, we only have limited time, so I want to make sure we get to two more really important things. And the first one is, it's hard to say, how do we fix this? But what are some of the ways in which we need to go towards this? Rabbi, as I was getting ready, I was on your website and I was reading about some of your work, and especially on reconciliation and forgiveness, and that our conversations around this need to be more than just forgive and let go, because that is not an adequate or effective, or in my opinion, ethical model. As we get towards this, and I'd like to hear from both of you, we have about 5 minutes left. What are some of the things that people should and can be doing? Because it's not just a matter of forgiving people their bad behavior, because it's more complicated than that. Maybe, Rabbi, we can start with you, and Faith, and I'd love to hear your take.
Yes, on one foot, as we say, definitely forgive and forget is not something that that works for significant harm. I just wrote Unrepentance and Repair is my new book on the work of repair, which is about owning the harm that you caused and doing a certain number of steps around transforming yourself and attending to the harmed party in order to create a transformed, both yourself, care for the victim, and transforming the world. So people who have been harboring anti-Semitic views, have been doing anti-Semitism, have some work to do to clean up both internally and externally. And the labor is not on the victim. But really what people can do is to educate themselves about what anti-Semitism is, because by definition, anti-Semitism is slippery. Right? It's hard to grab. It's hard to see, right? It's behind the scenes. It's the deep state, right? Oh, those globalists, like it's euphemisms. It's the thing at the bottom of every conspiracy theory, ends in Jews. It's supposed to be hard to see. And the nature of anti-Semitism is that it even works better when Jews are doing okay in a society. Right. And America is the best we've ever done. Right. Poland, Russia, Iraq, Tunisia, like we haven't always been doing so great. And anti-Semitism works better when we're okay. So for people to understand what anti-Semitism is and how it functions helps them to better identify it and then push back against it. And that's where allyship and solidarity and remembering that we are all in this together and that liberation is a group project is really, really critical.
I love that. Liberation is a group project. But I really love what you were just saying, because you're right. It is slippery. And I think seeing all of the ways its tentacles are in different places and being able to say, that's what I'm talking about, and actually pointing it out is how we start changing it. Because once you see it, you don't unsee it. Faith, we only have a few minutes left. I want to make sure I get to you. Are there any other solutions that people should be looking at? Is there anything people should be lobbying for? Or is this more about local organizing too?
Well, every issue is also always about local organizing, for sure. I'll be very brief. And I understand that legislation and policy can feel kind of dry in this context, but there's a couple things to highlight. I think first, there is a bill, Congress is not going to get to it this term, but maybe in the future, called the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which would help shift that kind of big ship toward assessing and addressing the threat of domestic terrorism as posed by white supremacy. And I think another thing that has also bubbled up recently, so there's been members of Congress this week called for a whole of government approach to address anti-Semitism. They sent a letter to the Biden administration. I think a whole of government approach is a great idea. And I would urge the administration to broaden the mandate of such a task force, should one emerge, to address white supremacy broadly. By addressing white supremacy, we also address anti-Semitism, and it lets us address some of the other intersections that we've talked about today. So those are two, I think, quick things. We can lobby on the first thing. I think the second thing, we can lobby on that too.
On that second thing, does it make sense for people to call their elected representatives and say, I want to make sure that you are pushing this and that you are in alignment with this?
I think you can. I think you can call and say, what are you doing about this? Open a conversation, start a conversation. And then if you don't like what they say, if it doesn't feel enough to you, share that. Share why it doesn't feel enough and what else you want to see done.
Thank you. Thank you. We are unfortunately out of time, and I still have so many things I wanted to talk about, but we only get our 30 minutes together. I am Rabbi Faith. I am so appreciative of both of you, all of the work, especially that's happening out of NCJW, which is so important. Thank you both for being here. I'm hoping that we can continue this conversation in the new year, because it shouldn't be a once a year discussion that we're having.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, everybody, that wraps up yet one more show. As we get towards the end of our year, definitely listen to those things that we talked about in this conversation. If you don't understand the nature of anti-Semitism, maybe your commitment for today is to learn a little bit more about it, to understand where it comes from and all of the ways it shows up, some of which you may have never noticed before. Because liberation is a project for all of us. It's a group activity. So we will see you again next week in another great show as we cruise towards the end of the year and our holiday vacations. If you need help before then, please visit us at pflag.org to locate your nearest chapter. Also, while you're there, make sure you check out our Read with Love program. We have resources associated with this program. So again, if you go to that discussion series link, you'll be able to get more information. We will see you again next week, and we leave you with the way we sign off every week, reminding you to run fast, laugh hard, but most of all, please be kind. Have a great week, everyone.